it over there later. Nope, there we go. Got it. Okay, good. So today we're going to be talking all about neuroscience and how it's related to shadow work, and how shadow work is really the key to getting that brain and body connection fully integrated so that you can just live your most aligned life. For those of you guys who are new to my world, I'm Danielle Massi. I'm a licensed psychotherapist with a background in cognitive neuroscience, and I'm also a totally woo spiritual shadow worker. And the fun stuff for me is when I can really merge those two worlds, because they feel so unrelated. It feels like you can't have both. You can't have both the science and the woo. And in fact, that could not be further from the truth. The science and the woo are completely interconnected. They are one. And so when we can find a way to tie them together and to really join the science and the woo, that's where some magical stuff happens. So for those of you who are just joining me for the first time, just a little bit more about me and how I got into this place. My background is as a licensed psychotherapist, and I started my work in doing a double major in neuroscience because I was so interested in the brain. The brain is one of the least mapped parts of us. We have no idea about most of the brain. Hey, Erica. The brain is just something that has really confused researchers for a very long time. There's so little that is known about it. In fact, in one of my early neuroscience classes, my professor told us, everything you're reading in this textbook is already outdated. Every single thing that you're reading is already outdated because we are constantly learning more. We're constantly getting new information about the brain and the way that it works. So it's fascinating to really integrate that into the work that we do in the spiritual sense, because we don't know so much, and yet there's still a lot that we do know. And so I'm going to tell you guys what we do know and how it relates. And I'm going to try to go as slow as I can, because I know that the neuroscience stuff can get a little jargony. So if anything feels confusing, feel free to put it in the chat box. Ask me questions. I'm here to teach you guys. I want to talk to you about all the things. And so don't be shy. Make sure to ask. So let's start with the brain. At birth, our brains are sort of like a blank slate. Not entirely true, but for our purposes, I want you to imagine it almost like a vast desert. Like there's nothing there. And from the time that we're born, we have the capacity to create roads down this desert space. We have the capacity to create roadways, pathways, exits off of those things, but we don't necessarily know how to do it. And so what happens is we look to our experiences. And so from birth, we have a whole slew of experiences, from the first time that we lock eyes with our mom, if that's the case, or the first time we eat food and we have to use that sucking reflex of actually taking our mouth and making this face, right? Which is all experience. And every experience that we have from the time that we're born begins to allow us to create roadways in this vast desert of the brain. And so when experiences happen multiple times, like say using that sucking reflex to eat food, because that's a very common experience for babies to have from the time that they're born, on and on and on and on again, what happens is those pathways are able to be created very deeply and very profoundly. They're strong connections within the brain. And so they wire themselves. So imagine that vast desert, and imagine that a very, very deep highway is laid down, like a 3-lane highway. Because in this 3-lane highway, we know this is something for certain, this is something we can rely on, this is something we can depend on, it's always going to be here. So when we have experiences as children that are negative, we also can rely on those, and those become very, very deep highways across this vast space. So this is where childhood trauma, even things that wouldn't feel traumatic to you now, because as an adult you can look back and rationalize and understand, as a child, it's not as easy. We take things very personally. We're very hurt by things, and our emotions lead us because the rest of the brain is not yet fully formed. We don't have the connections that we need to understand. What happens is that we take those negative experiences and we create pathways. And those pathways may look like things along the lines of, I'm unworthy, or I'm unlovable. Because I've had so many experiences as a child that made me feel like that was the truth. I had enough experiences that pathway gets laid down very strongly, and there's some exits coming off of those pathways, some highways that connect to it, really, really strong connections in my brain that make me feel like I am unworthy. And as an adult, those pathways don't necessarily go away. We keep them with us, and we actually look to use them as adults. So if you have things that bother you as an adult that don't bother, say, your friends or other family members is because that neural pathway exists in your brain and not in theirs. And so just in case I didn't say this before, those deep, long highways, these really embedded things set in our brain are neural pathways. Our neurons connect together and through dendrites and axons send information across, and we have these really strong pathways that exist. And no two people on the planet, no one has a brain that looks anything like anyone else's, because your experiences are so different, good, bad, or otherwise. All of us have different experiences. And so our brains are wired based on that. It's the reason why we can all be looking at the exact same circumstance and feel differently about it. It might be something that triggers someone. It might be something that someone else is excited about. It might be something that terrifies me. It might be something that has no effect on someone else that's watching it. Our brains are all different. And so this is extremely important because there is one thing that we all have in common with our brain, and that is that our brains like to hide things from us. Our brains take certain things that happen to us, certain neural pathways, and they go, oof, this person is not ready to understand this, they're not ready to hear it, and so let's just put this somewhere else. Let's put this out of their mind. And so many of our experiences, many of our memories that we have as young children, or even as adults, if we had tumultuous, traumatic situations like a bad car accident or an altercation of sorts, what happens is the brain decides, this is too much for you. This is something you're not going to know what to do with. This is going to make your mind sort of explode. So we're just going to put it somewhere. We're going to stick this in the back somewhere and not let you access it. And so now we have two separate things going on. We have these neural pathways that are sending information that's very, very consistent, that lets us do what we do, but we don't always know why, because the reason the pathway was laid down in the first place is hidden from us. And so let's just say I'm someone who had a horrible car accident when I was 10 years old, and it made me mistrust other people because maybe it was the person who was driving my car's fault. And now I can't trust adults. I don't feel like they keep me safe. I don't feel like being in their care is something that's going to be good for me. And so I lay down a strong neural pathway and reinforce it a ton with the idea that I need to take care of me because no one else is taking care of me. But I don't know where it came from. I can't find it. When people ask me how I became that way, I don't have a clue. I just know it's something that's really important for me. It's something that I have to do to keep myself feeling safe. This is where our unconscious becomes so important. Because when we know where it comes from, we can do the work to heal it. But if we have no idea where it is, we're out of luck. We're out of luck. So we need to understand the origins of our trauma. We need to understand why they came in the first place. We need to know where they are, we need to find them, and we need to heal them. So just to make sure everybody's still with me, if anything about that so far sounds confusing, put it in the chat, and I will make sure to answer any questions that you guys have. I know that this stuff is a little nerdy and a little sciencey, jargony, all those things, but it looks like you guys are sticking with me, so awesome. Now we have to talk about the other part of this physical body, because so far we're just operating from here up, right? We're just talking about the brain, but the brain is not just in your head. Your spinal cord, which runs the whole way down your body, is technically a part of that system. It's still a part of your brain. And this spinal cord that runs down has a big long nerve running through it called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is how our body receives and transmits its messages. So something as simple as like knowing not to touch something because it's hot, that runs through the vagus nerve. It's a very, very important part of our brain system. And it's the place where fight or flight kicks in. I know you guys have heard about fight or flight, or fight, flight, and freeze, depending on what you guys have learned so far. So that response, that fight, flight, freeze response that we all experience, is our body's response to anything that is potentially triggering. Anytime we fear something, anytime there's something that makes us go, ooh, this is something I should be afraid of, we go into either fight, flight, or freeze, depending on our past experiences, depending on our neural pathways. So if your neural pathway for freezing is very strong because that saved you in the past, or maybe it saved you one time, that is going to be your body's chosen response. If your neural pathways are very, very strongly laid down for the freeze response, that's where you're going to go. If it's for fight, that's going to be what you choose. And it's all based on your experiences. If you were that little kid who was fighting back constantly, wouldn't let anyone push them around, you never ever get backed into a corner, you're going to be a kid who has the neural pathway laid out very strongly for fight. It's always different. It's different for all of us. What happens is once we know what to do with a trigger, so say we see something that's potentially harmful in our path, our neural pathway kicks in and says, oh, take this highway. We need to run. We need to flight. We need to get out of here. It sends the message to the body, and the body responds. It starts pumping adrenaline and cortisol so that we can run away. And what happens when the adrenaline and cortisol pumps is all the blood goes to our limbs so that we can run, we can get out of there. If we're a fighter, we're going to fight back. We need all the blood in our limbs. So things as simple as like you don't have to go to the bathroom when you're in fight or flight because all the blood moved away from your bladder because it needs to get to your limbs. And other things that will happen with that too is we'll have our heart start to pump like crazy because we need to have that energy to move. We need to get out of here. Our palms will sweat, chest will tighten, we'll get really anxious. And this is really helpful way back when, caveman days, because if you saw a bear coming at you, you needed to be able to jump into action and get out of here. But most of us don't have situations like that regularly anymore. Most of us have situations like I have an exam and I'm terrified, or I have to confront my partner about something that's very uncomfortable and now I'm switching into fight or flight. Or worse, what happens is we have unconscious trauma that sits somewhere in the background of our mind with a strong neural pathway that anytime we're triggered in a way that reminds us of that unconscious trauma, we have the neural pathway that comes in that says freeze or run or fight. And it tells our body what to do, but we don't know why. We don't know why we're doing it. And so all the stuff that lives in our unconscious is training our brain and our body to act on our behalf, but we don't understand why we're doing it. And so I can't even tell you how many times in the past over a decade that I've been a therapist that people come into my office and go, I cannot help but fight with my partner. I want to rip their head off. And you can't figure out why it's triggering until you realize there's an unconscious trauma that is the stem of it. That's the origin. Unconscious traumas are the beginning of this whole brain and body disconnect of not knowing why we do what we do. Okay, someone asked a question. If you show signs of emotional immaturity, can you go back and emotionally heal and develop that area? Absolutely. So this gets to be like a little bit Freudian in its delivery, but essentially when we have unconscious trauma or conscious trauma, we can regress and get stuck in that age. So even when we're triggered by something as simple as a friend hurting our feelings, it'll bring us back to when we were 12 and that happened for the first time. If we can go into that place and do the full healing, that stops happening. We can look at it as a 30 or 20 something or 40 something or 50 something, whatever age we are, and say, this is where I'm at right now, this is how I feel about it. And what we do when we do that is we create a brand new neural pathway. And that becomes the one that persists. Because once you do it one time, you get like a street, like a very clear street in the brain, a thin neural pathway. When you do it 4 times, 5 times, 100 times, now it becomes like a 6-lane mega highway with all kinds of exits coming off of it, and it's strong. And this is why shadow work is so important, because when we can go in and do this stuff and change our brains, what we're doing is we're not just changing the neural pathways, we're changing our body's response. We're changing the amount of stuff that our brain is hiding from us in the unconscious, and we're essentially changing our lives, starting from the inside out. But we can only do this when we can access the unconscious, which is why shadow work is the answer to this problem. If you feel triggered by things and you don't understand why, if you question why certain things bother you, or why you regress to a certain age, or why a partner regresses to a certain age, the answer is unconscious trauma that exists within the brain. And this gets more and more complicated and convoluted when we realize how much actually lives in the unconscious. There's so much information that our brain stores in that place because it's unsure of how you're going to be able to handle it. And it is truly a safety mechanism. Our brains are trying to protect us. But when they do that, when they hide all of this stuff in the unconscious, we end up having situations like wanting to launch a business, getting ready to put it out there, our mouth goes to open up and we just shut down. Because unconsciously our brain has chosen the neural pathway of the freeze response. The adrenaline and the cortisol start to pump, and just like every time before, I start to freeze. My limbs lock up, my heart is racing, my brain gets foggy. I don't know what I want to say. This happens over and over. And a couple people said, been there, same. We all have these experiences. We can all recall a time when we act a certain way, and 30 seconds later we were like, where did that come from? Why did I do that? I didn't mean to act that way. Because in the conscious level, we know that that's not what we want to do. But unconsciously, we have a war going on that we need to settle. Someone said, is it best to tackle shadow work through hypnosis, talk therapy, or do you handle it another way? Yeah, this is a great question. So let me just explain a little bit about what the differences of each of these are. So let's start with talk therapy. When we use talk therapy, what we do is we have a therapist who's trained at pulling these unconscious moments out for us. And so they're looking for signs and signals of them. I'm a licensed therapist, so this is something that I've done for over a decade. What I find from my perspective is that it works, but it takes a long time because we need to see enough signs and symptoms to know that the neural pathway is there to decide that we need to attack it. And so it's a timely process, but it's extremely rewarding. And so if you're someone who likes to slow play it and really get there by yourself, this is the mode for you, 100%. Then we have hypnosis, which is also an extremely powerful tool. I love hypnosis. I'm not someone who practices it myself, but hypnosis is powerful because you get right to the point. You get in there, you pull it out, you see it, you deal with it, and then it goes away. The method that I use is actually using deep meditation. And so you are fully conscious as we access your unconscious. So you're fully present, you're seeing it, you're with me on the journey as we go in. And what I do is we work to first calm the body down through that same vagus nerve. We calm the body, we switch it into the opposite of fight or flight, which is rest and digest. And once the body is so calm and so at ease, all the walls that your brain puts up, all the walls that protect the stuff that's hidden in your unconscious, come down. It's the reason why sometimes when we sleep, some of that stuff will kind of filter over. We'll have nightmares of things that we don't remember, but they actually happened to us, or we saw them on TV and our brain was putting them somewhere. We relive them because when we sleep, when our body is that calm, the walls that the unconscious is hidden behind come down. So that's what we're doing. We're pulling those walls down while you're lucid, while you're fully awake, while you're ready to go after them. And when we do that, when we do this deep meditative work to go in there and we extract it out, you become a conscious partner in it, where you can see it and face it head on. And then we do trauma-informed work to make sure that the body stays calm, that you're really keeping that vagus nerve in check as we move through it, so that we retrain the brain at the same time to choose a different path. When we choose a different path than we're used to, so say we have that very, very strong neural pathway that's like, we need to fight. If we choose differently by saying, actually, we don't even need to be in fight or flight right now. We can look at this from a distance and go, I'm safe, I'm okay. This is something I consciously want to handle, and I'm going to keep my body regulated as I do it. What happens is we choose a different pathway, and that old highway that we've always used starts to shrink. And each time we choose this pathway instead of this one, it shrinks more and more and more until it disintegrates. And that is a neural process that happens in our brains all the time. This is like the degenesis. It's like a synaptic pruning is the wording for it. It's when your brain chooses to get rid of certain neural pathways to make space for others, because it's like, nobody's using that pathway. Let's just get rid of it. We all do this all the time without realizing it. It's like when you're little, you have the ability to speak any language. Your mouth can form the specific words. You are prepared to speak whatever language because maybe you're going to be born in France or New Zealand or Shanghai or California. And so you need to be prepared. So your brain has the ability to wire itself for any. But as you start to speak, if your family is not bilingual or trilingual, what will happen is you'll lose the ability to make certain sounds. And so for all of you guys watching this right now, there are certain things, certain sounds that you might not be able to make if you didn't make as a kid. Like being able to roll your R's, like some of you watching, is probably a pretty even split. Some of you probably can't do that because the neural pathways have faded away. Or whistling. If you didn't learn to whistle very young, you won't be able to. You can't really learn it later because your tongue doesn't form the correct movement. I can't whistle. I didn't learn young enough, and so the neural pathways that were needed to make that tongue movement, they went away. That's synaptic pruning. And so shadow work is the process of going into the unconscious to heal your neural pathways by getting rid of old ones, creating new ones, and retraining the body to be so connected to the brain that it's all connected. Someone said that's fascinating. I can't do either of those. Hope, this is so funny, but there's so many of those that we can and can't do just based on what we did as kids. And there are other things you might be able to do that some of the rest of us can't because you accessed them as a child. People who play piano, who had to take piano lessons as a kid, they have more neural pathways for finger movement than those who did not. And it's all just based on what you did as a child. This is why shadow work is so important, because we can go in and make space. We can get rid of the things that are plaguing you and holding you back. If you all stop and think for a moment about the stuff that bogs you down, about the situations that you get into that over and over and over again, you're like, why is this pulling me back? Why is this stopping me? There's no reason. I can't find it. It's because it's in your unconscious. And it is literally a 2-session process of pulling that out, getting rid of it, making it go away. It's that easy. But you have to do the work to let it be that easy. You have to trust. You have to go in there. You have to find it and pull it out. Steph, I love you so much. You have to do the work. And every time you do it, it never stops. And so like in my Create Your Light Academy, which is my group program, we have 8 weeks where we go in and every single week we do a different one of these, right? We pull them out and we pull them out and we pull them out. And each time we're doing that, we are changing your brain. We are changing your physiological response. And as we do that, we're also changing your aura. And we do this over and over again. And I also record them all so you can do them again on your own forever. They're recorded and with you forever. So you could go in and do them 1,000 times. You could literally be a different person 3 months after beginning because your brain is so different. It is like you are literally a different person. The things that used to bother you are inconsequential. The things that used to trigger you are not even on your radar because it's all gone. That's the power of shadow work. And so I hope that this was informative. I know it was a lot to process. So if anyone has questions, do not hesitate to DM me. I'm so nerdy. I love talking about this stuff. I'm also hosting a VIP day on September 22nd. And this is for everyone, men and women. And we're going to be going in deeply to do this deep shadow work together as a group with some brain altering exercises to make sure that you get as much out of this as humanly possible. And I kept the price really low. It's $22 because I want everyone who's interested in this work, who's ready to go in there and do this, to have access to it. It's going to be 3 hours long and it is going to change your life. And so I hope to see you all there. I love you all so much. Bye, everybody.